1970s, Queen had established a reputation for themselves as one of the most innovative, exciting and popular rock bands in the world.
One of the greatest, most innovative, unique rock bands of all time. Their influence is huge, and part of the reason why they are such a great band is that no one can emulate what they did, even close to its diversity.
They're known as great record makers. They were also a great live act who attracted very, very large audiences. But most of all, they made a series of important records.
Every hook is a killer, every riff is in the right place, and you've got Freddie Mercury singing his heart out.
Yet despite these achievements, Queen were about to begin a new chapter in their remarkable story, one which would see them go from strength to strength and ultimately seal their fate. This programme is a review of Queen during the 1980s, the music they made and the phenomenal musicians who made it.
Am I going to mug you?
Is that gorgeous or what, eh?
And I believe I can run a decent marathon.
Thank you very much.
Download Veely now.
Towards the end of 1980, the British music scene was in a state of fluctuation. Queen, now very much part of the rock establishment, had begun to find their overall relevance called into question.
Punk did not export, but it did have a great impact on British music makers. The period leading up to punk was the period in which British music ruled the world, and consequently there were tremendous sums available to artists like Queen who had had world success.
Punk, of course, I suppose they'd more or less waved hello to in passing. There's the tale of Freddie Mercury's encounter with Sid Vicious. Kind of sums it up. They were in a studio, and the Sex Pistols were in the next studio, and Freddie greeted him as, "Oh, hello, Mr. Ferocious." And that was about it, I think.
I think Queen decided that realistically, if they were going to survive into the 80s and the challenges of the young bucks on the scene, then they had to appeal to specific markets. And I think that's what they tried to do at the beginning of the 80s. They started to pick up on disco, more funk, new romantics even.
I think rock, as maybe people had known it in Britain, had sort of fractured, and I think, say, groups like the Police had come along with their sort of hybrid of punk and reggae and rock. Queen sort of came in through the middle of that because they were quite clearly moving away from some of the high opera that had happened with the Night at the Opera album or the Day at the Races album, and were making sort of more tightly focused pop songs.
It was in typically contrary nature that Queen issued their final release of 1980, the soundtrack to a new remake of high-camp cinema serial Flash Gordon.
Clytus, I'm bored. What plaything can you offer me today?
An obscure body in the SK system, Your Majesty. The inhabitants refer to it as the planet Earth.
I like to play with things a while before annihilation.
Pathetic earthlings! Who can save you now?
I must admit that when I first heard Queen were doing the Flash Gordon soundtrack, I was a little bit taken aback. But having seen the movie, which is the first time I actually heard the soundtrack in context, it makes perfect sense. It was a spoof, it was camp, it was comic, it was arty, it was elaborate, it was over the top. It was everything that Queen were and are.
Savior of the universe.
Has provided any explanation.
I have a very fond personal memory of Flash Gordon because my co-authors and I of the book, the Guinness Book of Hits of the 70s, held a party to launch it in the members' dining room of the House of Commons, and we invited representatives of every act who had had a #1 during the 70s. Freddie came wearing a Flash Gordon t-shirt. He was excited about the film and the work they had done for it.
It was a great combination of movie and rock music, and it's quite daring, really, in a way. Nobody had done anything like that before. When you first hear it, you think this is a very camp kind of cod piece of humour, but it works very well, actually. It's like a cartoon in sound.
The standout point of the album, and indeed the best remembered moment, would remain the characteristically over-the-top title track.
To me, that album is just a soundtrack album. I know it sold quite well as an album because it was Queen, but I don't think it's a significant musical part of their career. All you can remember, and I have played it again recently, all you can remember out of it is Flash.
We played it on the radio not that long ago because we had Brian Blessed doing some voiceovers for Virgin Radio, and we thought, oh, we'll stick it on just for a bit of a laugh. And actually, it's still quite a good song. You know, it's incredibly camp, it's a lot of fun, but you've got to go and watch the movie.
I think the idea of the film, though it wasn't entirely successful, was to make this big camp British rival to Star Wars. And, you know, what better band to score it if you wanted something that was sort of deliciously over the top.
Go, Flash, go! Flash Gordon would also mark an interesting development in Queen's 80s career. The decision to produce movie soundtracks.
Apart from doing Flash Gordon, they also did Highlander in the mid-80s, and that was quite an advanced, spooky kind of film anyway. So, really, yes, I think Queen's music is perfectly suited to soundtracks, and I think you needed that kind of theatrical background, that sort of feel for drama and showmanship, really, which, of course, Freddie Mercury had, and the rest of the band. So Queen were perfectly suited to providing music for movies.
The part of Queen's work that lends itself to the cinematic environment is its grand scale. Because just from 4 people, they have a very large sound. And of course, the screen is to a dramatic work compared to the stage what Queen are to an acoustic group.
The whole sphere and the whole sweep of their music was so vast. It was a panorama. It was its own film soundtrack. It didn't take much to adapt and adopt to a film setting because there's a visual aspect to their music anyway.
I'm sure that Queen had the capability to actually match some of the classic movie soundtrack writers who are writing background music, atmosphere music, who are really dedicated to that function within the movie.
I'm sure had they gone on and had Freddie been healthy, they would have done more film work.
Queen's next move, however, would take them out of the cinematic realm and back into the studio. Recording in Montreux, it was here that they embarked on a collaboration with nearby resident David Bowie. The result, released in October 1981, would be a #1 single entitled Under Pressure.
You could tell from the moment you heard it was just one of those tracks that was going to grab people. Obviously it had something of the same appeal as Another One Bites the Dust, in that sort of slower, sort of precise, sort of funky way where they were still feeding a bit off Chic, but of course they had Bowie's input, and he'd had his own take on all that disco funk thing from the mid-70s onwards.
How they got together with David Bowie was purely accidental. He happened to be living at the time just literally down the road and heard that Queen were in and they were recording. Met up, had a few beers, had a few drinks, la 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 la, one thing led to another. They demoed on this little track. It was never even meant to be released. I think they were just mucking around.
It's a great song, and it really represented where both parties were at that point. Neither wanted to look back. Both wanted to move forward, because Bowie never stood still. Bowie constantly looked to evolve. Queen never stood still. Queen constantly looked to change. What they saw working together was It's a challenge, isn't it? Can we really collaborate? Can we truly bring out the best in each other? Come up with a song that both are happy with, that both are equal in, and make it work commercially and artistically. And they did it. They did it absolutely magnificently.
Yeah, it worked very well, and it was a tremendous hit, obviously. So, although actually some people think that Freddie Mercury actually was rather in awe of David Bowie's work on that song. But I think that they worked well together as a team, so it was like two like minds.
Strangely enough, I think what I hear is Freddie being intimidated by Bowie. There's a line in there, it's the terror of knowing what this world is about, that Bowie sings. I'm sure he wrote that line. That just is so Bowie, the terror of knowing what this world is about.
The terror of knowing what this world is about. Watching the good friends screaming, let me out.
It's a bit like Bowie is like, look, you know, I'm the governor here. You know, you're very good, Freddie, but, you know, I'm in charge. And, like, Freddie's not letting him get away with it. And just the build and the pathos of the song is incredible.
The track would also feature on Queen's next album. Released in May 1982, Hot Space saw the band fully embracing a disco sound. In a decade which would see them continually evolving, this was one of Queen's most controversial artistic decisions.
To this day, I'm puzzled by the Hot Space album. When I first heard it, I hated it. Absolutely loathed it. Because it wasn't Queen. You could barely hear what Queen were about.
It was a period when Queen were heavily involved in disco, and so was perhaps everybody else in the music business. So, yeah, strangely enough, for me anyway, not one of their most memorable of albums.
Well, I absolutely love Hot Space. I would say it's one of my favourite Queen albums. I loved a lot of their influences into that. I think they were very influenced by the group Chic, who I think were one of the most important groups of the latter half of the 20th century, because they coincided with disco and people see them as a disco group, but making these sort of classic timeless records, of which, of course, Good Times was one of them.
Despite the popularity of disco music in general, Queen was soon to find that their interpretation of the genre would not be so warmly received.
Freddie wanted to go for sort of a bit of a disco feel, and the American fans particularly didn't like that. I think this was an album really for die-hard Queen fans.
It was as if they were trying to make a disco album where they could immerse themselves so deep you couldn't hear Queen in it. I didn't like the songs much, didn't like the performances, didn't like the production. Quite like the cover, so you had that plus.
Most of you know that we got some new sounds out last week, and for what it's worth, we're going to do a few songs in the funk black category, whatever you call it. That doesn't mean we've lost our rock and roll feel, okay? This is a stage.
Before then, nobody would have thought of Queen, for all their diversity in the 70s. I don't think anyone would have thought of Queen as being likely to follow a sort of black music, disco kind of sound. And when we're talking about Chic, we are talking about black disco.
In retrospect, however, both Queen fans and critics alike have come to view Hot Space as something of an underappreciated oddity.
Listening to it now, I can identify certain aspects that are Queen. I still feel it's the least convincing of all the Queen albums. And I think the problem was that maybe they were too locked into being adventurous and they took their fan base a little too readily for granted.
Hot Space seems to me an album of two halves, if you like. There's 5 tracks on it that I'd think of as highly disco-influenced or actually disco, one or the other. It seems to me sort of a half-good album, basically. With a great title. Hot Space is exactly what those 5 tracks are. You know, they're really sparse. They've really learnt the lesson of Chic. They've really studied that and they know how it works.
I think the tensions of the album, you got Mercury and Deacon wanting to take it down a funk and dance route, while you've got May and Taylor wanting to keep it in a rock style. So you've got a very schizophrenic album. You've got the sort of dance side and the rock side.
For me, the highlight of the Hot Space album was Las Palabras de Amor, and it probably helped them with their Latin audience.
Don't touch me now, don't hold me now, don't break the spell, darling, now you are near. Look in my eyes and speak to me, those special promises I want to hear. Las palabras de amor.
Foreign territories love even the slightest nod indicating that you are aware of their existence. And to do a few lines in Spanish helped them tremendously in Spanish language territories.
But for God's sake, we need las palabras de amor. Let me hear the words of love.
Even though Queen had obtained superstar status in South America, the 80s would see their popularity in the Northern Territories diminish greatly. Hot Space had been something of a disaster in the United States, and their next single, Body Language, thanks to a particularly racy sleeve cover and video, would find itself taking a troubled place in the American market.
Body language.
America's very conservative, and it is America we're talking about when you're talking about that single, because it was banned in America. They had to completely rechange the cover.
The sexy cover was withdrawn, as had the original Hendrix cover to Electric Ladyland, and the original Blind Faith cover, and a whole lot of other sleeves. So that didn't help sales of the record.
They put the pressure on the record label, who put the pressure on the band, who basically were left with, well, you've got 2 choices here. The single doesn't come out in America, or we're new to the cover. What do you want to do? And Queen reluctantly agreed to go for a different cover. I don't think they were happy about it, but they realised that in America, you've got to be more conservative.
Tipper Gore was getting the Washington Wives together to protest obscene and violent lyrics in heavy metal songs. So there was a vibe about in America at the time, quite specifically.
Look at me, I got a case of body language. Look at me, I got a case of body language. Look at me, I got a case of body language. Look at me, I got a case.
In the midst of all this fuss, Queen's motives had begun to seem slightly unsure. Many people felt that the band were trying to provoke controversy.
I think that Queen did actually provoke controversy quite deliberately sometimes, because they knew they could do it and get away with it. They were kind of at the forefront of a whole sort of loosening up of the media and broadcasting and in general that was happening in the 80s and has really reached fruition now.
I honestly don't believe that the other members of the band, sort of having met, you know, quite a few of them over the years, sought controversy. I mean, Brian May, I can't see Brian May as quite a controversial character. And I wonder really, you know, when they were attending album launches with naked girls and food covered all over them and dwarf lift attendants and stuff, really what the other 3 members thought. What the hell was going on? I mean, it's quite bizarre. I think this was probably all orchestrated by Freddie, who had a wicked sense of humour.
Freddie was really breaking loose sexually. And the rest of the group usually deferred to him on these matters.
I'm just trying to sort of imagine sort of Brian really turning up at one of these album launches and sort of going, oh, God, not again. Freddie did it again.
Brian May, personally, is never going to be known as a sexual renegade. He looks too much like a serious musician to be taken seriously as a sex freak. John Deacon is too quiet to be known as a sex freak, and Roger Taylor, although he appreciated beautiful women, was not scandalous. Therefore, I think they thought, let's use something to counter our squareness.
Your body. Don't talk, don't talk, don't talk, don't talk, don't talk.
Following this somewhat difficult period, Queen decided to take a year-long sabbatical. However, by September, they were already working on their next album. Many see this prolific nature as proof that Queen were dedicated, hard-working musicians who were simply unable to resist the lure of the studio for too long.
I get the feeling that Queen were driven by two forces in the early 80s. One was a determination to be as dynamic and as creative as possible, and the feeling that who knows what tomorrow may bring. Strangely and sadly, of course, it ended many years later in Freddie Mercury's illness and death. The second was a fear that if they went off the scene for too long, people will forget who they were. Those forces pushed them forward and made them, I feel, get back into work mode.
They turned out a fantastic number of albums at a tremendous rate, which was normal for the period, is another factor. You know, the business was changing at that stage.
They produced at a pace which would astound and challenge modern artists. They were usually good for a new album every couple of years.
You've got to remember, Queen didn't really have a hit album until their third release. If that was now, we would have never got the latest stuff because they would have been dropped, you know? So I think that record companies probably cracked the whip quite harder back in the 80s.
People at the time did tend to take groups like Queen for granted. Another single by Queen. But when you think of how much work went into the lyrics and the production and the whole structuring of the songs and the ideas and the humour and the drama and all the things that they put into a 3-minute single or a 6-minute single in some cases.
Queen liked working, they liked being in each other's company recording. And I think maybe there was a feeling that, you know, Hot Space hadn't hit quite as they wanted it to. And it was time to go back to sort of, you know, the more fundamental approach to the music.
This return to a more traditional Queen sound was highlighted perfectly by their next single, a Roger Taylor composition called Radio Gaga.
I sit alone and watch your light, my only friend through teenage nights. Everything I had to know, I heard it on my radio.
Phenomenal record. Still love playing it, and it doesn't sound dated. So many songs in the 80s sound dated. There was that sort of, you know, keyboard thing going on in the 80s that everybody did, and the studio sessions were all of a certain sort of sound. But Radio Gaga just blows me away. I love playing it.
Right, we're Queen, we're back. We're not going to do that funk stuff anymore. We're not going to try and, you know, blind you with science. We're going to do what we do. So I think it's fantastic for that.
It was of its time. It had a bit of an electronic feel, simple chorus, easy on the ear, and of course got a lot of airplay. And Queen were also, I think, wary of the fact they didn't know what they were coming back to. They hadn't been away too long, but you know what? Maybe our audience doesn't want us anymore. So they wanted to release something that got them across to as wide an audience as possible. Radio Gaga is one of those songs. It was written by Roger Taylor, inspired by his daughter and the whole thing about childlike speech.
It was just clearly a fantastically catchy track, and you know what a lovely thing it must have been for him as a writer. First time they played that in the stadium, and they get the Radio Gaga, bah, bah, you know, it's just lovely, isn't it? What a response.
I'd sit alone and watch your light, my only friend through teenage nights.
It's a wonderful concept, and it's Queen's ironic riposte to the popularity of MTV, which would not have existed had it not been for Bohemian Rhapsody. But the song Radio Gaga is an eloquent plea for radio to shape up its act, to present new music and great music without caring about what the act looks like, without caring what the video looks like.
Queen worked on two levels of that song. One, it appealed to a mass market, to a market who wanted to hear the song, buy it, and then moved on. Two, it appealed to the diehards because it was saying, we don't understand, we don't like the mass market. So we're going to actually put some stuff in there which you can understand as well. So it's quite a clever format, and it was catchy. Bottom line is it got played a lot because it was very catchy. And to this day, they play it live. The clap along, the chorus, all appealed to those things which make a pop single work.
The album, which contained Radio Gaga, would be released a month later, in February 1984. The works was widely heralded as a return to form, and in the UK at least, saw Queen rocket back to chart success.
The album that really, the British audience went, all right, we'll forget the last one. This is good. Thank God for that.
A special track on it is Hammer to Fall. If you like Brian May in heavy metal mode, that's really stood the test of time in its own way. It's completely Brian May being Jimmy Page and, doing his riffing away and doing that particular Queen thing, which they always did very well, of course.
I love Hammer to Fall because it has a real driving metal impact. Brian May seemed to be of the opinion, we've indulged in hot space. Okay, I laid back and I said my guitar was going to take a far lesser role. It's there, but it's not particularly what I want it to be. My price for it is I get the opportunity on the works to go out and do some stuff that's a bit heavier. And Hammer to Fall was perfect. It's a great track. It could have actually belonged to the 1970s.
It looked to many like Queen were about to reclaim a sizable chunk of their audience. Yet the furore surrounding their next single would see them effectively leaving their American career dead in the water.
I want to break free. You sing it. I want to break free from your life. You're so satisfied. I don't need you.
I Want to Break Free, which was another great track from the Works album, was by John Deacon, and it was also a hit record as well. It was a #3 hit single in the UK and a big hit throughout Europe as well.
It's very complex. It's a beautiful record, and it's one of those songs that still, out of all those Queen songs, stands the test of time.
It is a song that, in a way, sums up so many different elements. Break free from what? Who wants to break free? Maybe you can read too much into it. Maybe it was just a fun song and the words worked. Although subsequently and in retrospect, people believe it was Freddie Mercury saying, I want to break free from the morals and the morals of society. I want people to understand what drives me sexually, and I want people to accept it. I don't want to be restricted by having to hide who and what I am. I want to go out there and tell everybody.
Fred, it's true that the song I Want to Break Free is dedicated for the gay world?
No, not at all. Not at all. That song, to start off with, that song was written by John Deacon, you know, and, well, he's a very happily married
man, you know, with about four children. I don't think where you got that message from. It's got nothing to do with gay people at all. It's basically about everybody. It's just somebody who has a very tough life and he just wants to break free from whatever problems he's got. It's got nothing to do with the gay thing. Besides, it's not my song anyway. John wrote it.
It was not the content of the song, however, that was the main issue for their American audience, rather the antics of the band in this somewhat unconventional video.
I said to Freddie, you know, the thing about that video that I like the most is when you're going from one room to the next, you go at double time. Your feet do little steps. I said, I don't know how many people notice it, but I loved it. And he said, I'm so glad you noticed it. That's the thing about the video I'm proudest of. He loved it.
But life still goes on. I can't get used to living without you by my side.
The problem with I Want to Break Free, at least as far as America was concerned, was the video, which had the band in drag. America didn't understand the humour of it. We got it over here straight away. We've been used to men in drag throughout the decades, be it in music hall, pantomime, didn't matter. We all laughed at it and thought it was great fun.
I just don't think the Americans would have got it. I think it was a little bit too weird, but almost subtle.
It may have been that the joke went a bit too far. Maybe some of the videos and some of the images and some of the promotional material and the way they looked, the way they were dressing. It was very glam rock, of course, but maybe that put people off in the States. Maybe TV stations weren't ready for it.
I can't think that it was the main reason that their fortunes dipped in America, especially when you think that come the mid-'80s that the most successful rock bands in America were all these poodle-haired geezers with spandex tights, you know, I mean, camp? That's a bit camp, isn't it? They weren't lumberjacks. I think Freddie would have fitted right into that scene if he could have been bothered, and Brian, of course, had the haircut all along.
Yet it was not only in America that I Want to Break Free began to cause problems for the band.
They go play in Argentina. What they don't know is that the left-wing opposition in Argentina has adopted I Want to Break Free as their anthem. So Queen go out on stage. Apparently they put their togs on, the cross-dressing togs, and the audience starts to throw things at them because Queen don't know that they're insulting this freedom anthem.
I don't think the band understood what on earth was going on when the bottles rained down and so forth and had to scurry off.
Despite these difficulties, Queen kept apace with their stellar work ethic. Band members had now begun to release solo recordings, side projects which, to this day, only serve to further highlight the incredible diversity of talent within the group.
You have four such distinct sort of musical personalities, but it would be, in one sense, difficult to define them. You know, in the Beatles, you could say McCartney was the wistful one, and Lennon was the rocker, and George was the mystic, and Ringo was Ringo. Within Queen, they all mixed and matched. I mean, I think, you know, May and Taylor are the most traditionally sort of rocky, if you like.
I was never particularly fond of their solo outings. Brian May possibly came closer than anybody else because it was very much a hard rock event.
Without doubt, one of the greatest guitarists of all time. I think sometimes he gets a little overlooked, and I think sometimes he takes a bit of flack from sort of serious sort of muso journalists who have their heads wedged up their own backsides.
Most of the members of the band did solo albums, including Roger Taylor did an album, and he also launched his own band, The Cross.
A lot of Taylor's solo work, and certainly, you know, the first album was, you know, very sort of new wave influenced.
most active member of Queen in terms of solo work would remain John Deacon, traditionally seen by many as the quiet man of the band.
John Deacon is the secret weapon of Queen. Most of Deacon's compositions are just there, and they are like a classic verse, chorus, instrumental bit, and out again pop song.
In reality, I think their solo projects are no more than vanity affairs and lack the spark and sparkle of what made Queen happen. You didn't listen to the solo projects and think, wow.
I don't think that the Queen solo projects were their best work, even though Freddie's solo album was good.
Sometimes I feel I'm gonna break down and cry. So lonely. Nowhere to go, nothing to do with my time. I get lonely. So lonely. Living on my own. Sometimes I feel
I recall he invited me over to his home and he played me the record, and he was sitting there all the way through wanting to see what I thought of it. And I said at the end, I think there are 4 hit singles on here. And ultimately there were 4 hit singles, but of course he was not really going to know that because they didn't all succeed before his death.
lonely, 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 yeah. Sometimes ahead. Sometimes I feel nobody gives me no warning. Find my head is always up in the clouds in a dream world.
A month after the release of Freddie Mercury's first solo work, Queen were reunited and about to play what would become the most controversial gig of their career. The Sun City Super Bowl in South Africa, a place deep in the throes of the apartheid regime.
None of the members of Queen were racist or right-wing, but they gave the impression of feeding the apartheid regime.
It was a slap in the face for rock music actually being seen as apolitical. Queen did make a political statement. They can argue until they're blue in the face they didn't, but they did. And by doing so, they really didn't think through what was going on. And I really feel someone somewhere should have said to them, look, you go to Sun City, we know you're not supporting apartheid. It's going to be perceived as such. And whatever argument you put up is not going to be listened to. It's not going to be heard. Don't go. Don't do it. You don't need the money. It's not worth the aggro.
Apartheid was not at its peak. It was beginning to crumble. But I think only after the event and after the gig did they realise, probably not intentionally, but you know what that performance symbolised, not from the band, but how it was probably perceived. And I think that didn't go down well with some people. And I think the band, from what I've heard after, were quite disappointed in themselves for actually agreeing to take part in it.
Queen's reputation was now in tatters. Sun City could well have spelt the end for them. Yet there was something on the horizon, a single performance that, with one foul swoop, would see them rise from the ashes in the most triumphant fashion imaginable.
It's 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, and around the world it's time for Live Aid. Wembley welcomes their Royal Highnesses, the Prince and Princess of Wales.
Live Aid resuscitated the reputation of Queen as almost no event has ever done.
Initially, a reaction to Queen being on the bill was, oh yeah, here they go. They're going to try and use this to resurrect their career. Oh, ha, ha, ha. No chance whatsoever.
It was astonishing because I think that was the moment where a lot of people had forgotten maybe who Queen were. And certainly a lot of kids, wouldn't necessarily know. They might have known just a couple of the recent singles, and they came back and wow, they absolutely rocked it.
"17 minutes to impress the world, 17 minutes to showcase what your band can do and why you've got this slot." And Queen blew everybody else away. I mean, I can't even remember, really, other than the big sort of ensemble performance at the end, I can't really remember another performance from the day.
Just begun, but now I'm gonna throw it all away.
It's acknowledged, you know, as just one of the most potent 15 or 20 minutes in the history of rock and roll.
I have never, and that's a pretty strong word, seen a more powerful live performance by an individual than Freddie Mercury at Live Aid. He made love to the camera.
Every day, a little piece of you is falling away. Let your past go western waving. Try your line and play that game. Till the end, I stand and covers it.
Freddie was under doctor's orders not to perform. He had a throat problem, but he defied his doctor. He understood how important this gig was. And of course, when they do the radio Gaga, clap your hands over your head business, that was just chilling because there were so many people there. And they all voluntarily did the radio Gaga clap. And you realized, thank God, and many people thought this, Freddie Mercury uses this power for good. You could easily imagine a demagogue using this for evil ends.
Radio Gaga, Radio Boo-Boo, Radio Gaga. All we hear is Radio Gaga, Radio Gaga. Radio was you. Radio, someone still loves.
Freddie Mercury was just totally in charge of that crowd, you know, he had them in the palm of his hand, as they say. So it was a great turning point for Queen and a high spot for Live Aid.
Now fully rejuvenated, Queen ventured back into the studio. And in May of 1986, they unveiled their next album, A Kind of Magic. This had been preceded by the release of the title track a couple of months earlier, which had also featured on the soundtrack of the cult movie Highlander.
One prize, one goal red. What should be?
A Kind of Magic is a strong song, and it just sounds great when it opens up into the little guitar solo, and then Freddie laughs.
It's a kind of magic, 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 magic.
I think It's a Kind of Magic. It's a great pop song. That's the thing with Queen, that they never lost sight of a good single and a good tune, and even at their most grandiose, there's a great melody in there.
It gave lots of opportunities. Roger's song, but it gave lots of opportunities for Brian, who'd been somewhat lacking them in those early 80s albums, to play a rather different style for him, a very loose guitar style.
The song itself is quite almost a lightweight, kind of gentle disco kind of number, really. It's not heavy rock in the normal sense. I mean, Queen always played a variety of styles anyway.
I believe by the time they'd reached that point in their career, they'd realised how close they'd come to messing it all up and how lucky they were to have the whole thing revived and resurrected, that they could do multiple nights at Wembley Stadium again, or Milton Keynes, or anything like that, and know that the fans were there for them. And I think they began to appreciate it. So I think that was their way of actually acknowledging the rapport with their fans the consistency of their fans' support. And it is a really good song. And again, how can you knock it? Because it stays in your mind. It's the perfect pop song because as soon as you say the title, it stays in your mind.
I have to say, one of the big songs off the album, of course, is One Vision. And that's a strange one because it's another of these things where they make successfully an anthem, One Vision, whole world together. You know, it's like Freddie going like that. One Vision isn't as mawkish and daft as some of the meaning of life songs they do. It's got more power than that. And I think it's because there's a certain sarcasm about Freddie. Every time I've played that track, when he finishes it, instead of saying One Vision, I'm sure the last time he says fried chicken. The rest of the band, they're playing music that would make an anthem. But Freddie puts a question mark against anything in that area. So that's why this song is saved by, apparently, him in the last line saying, One Vision, fried chicken. Because it fits, you know. Thank you, Freddie, that's all right.
The album in general is also seen as having something of a soul music influence to it. This is particularly evident on the track 1 Year of Love.
In 1984, I did Careless Whisper with George Michael, and I suppose because of that, John had written this sort of, I suppose, quite a soulful tune, 1 Year of Love, for the Magic album. And he thought it'd be nice to have a saxophone solo rather than a guitar solo, so I guess he sold the idea to Freddie.
On that album, they make some quite credible soul sounds. They're doing that thing of going into an idiom and bringing their own character to it successfully. Sometimes they blow it. I don't recall them ever doing a soul, and certainly not convincingly before that.
Well, I think John probably was more into soul music than the others in the band were. I mean, as I say, when I first knew him in the 70s, it was the band I was working with was sort of a soul band. We used to do kind of James Brown and some funk and some Latin things. I think he liked that, and in a way he might have been more happy doing that sort of music than what he did with Queen. When that song came up, I thought, oh, this is a little bit like Rainy Night in Georgia.
Hovering by my suitcase, trying to find a warm place to spend the night.
Just 1 year of love is better than a lifetime alone. One sentimental moment in your arms is like a shooting star right through my heart. It's always
the backing's different and the time's different and the lyrical content's different, but there's still someone sort of belting it out like a soul man. And I think, you know, Freddie could do that, but then he could also belt it out like an opera singer at the same time. So, you know, a very interesting hybrid.
Well, Freddie seemed to be in very good spirits that day. He said, watch this, and he clicked the finger, and somebody came up, brought him a glass of wine, you know, and he clicked the finger the other side, and somebody else came along, brought him a cigarette. He had a few ideas for some other bits and pieces, so he'd say, well, you know, start on this note, and he sang me a note, and then did something, you know, we tried a few things. Well, I think it was just very professional, you know. Freddie obviously is very You know, he knew what he wanted. He was just very good at what he did. You know, I'm just grateful for John for having me along and being along for the ride.
Another track on the album, and also one that featured in Highlander, was the epic Who Wants to Live Forever, a song which has established itself as something of a fan favourite over the years.
Well, when you hear a song like Who Wants to Live Forever now, of course you feel a certain poignancy about it all, and wondered what thoughts were going through people's minds at the time they wrote it.
The problem with retrospect is you read certain values and certain meanings into things that were never there in the first place. The tragic death of Freddie Mercury from AIDS, which was a few years after it's a kind of magic album, means people look back on Who Wants to Live Forever, which was used in the Highlander movie as well, and feel, did they really mean to say this? Did they really mean to say that? Who knows? Only the writer and author of the song knows exactly what was going on in his mind at the time when they wrote the song.
Freddie is such a varied singer, and on that song, whilst it could bring out the Judy Garland in him in a bad way, to me, it's actually a soulful ballad performance. I think he's right in there, grappling with the fairly simple and yet strong sentiments of that Who Wants to Live Forever.
To live forever. Who dares to love forever? Oh, yeah. Who wants to live?
It's just that right mixture of poignancy and emotion. He would sing those songs, and I think they really could touch people's hearts, and I think, you know, that's a perfect example of it.
A kind of magic had ensured that Queen were now back at the top of their game. All seemed to be going well within the band. However, in 1987, Freddie Mercury received news that would have devastating implications. He had tested positive for the AIDS virus. Queen would never play live again. It would be 2 more years before they released another album. All the time, tabloid speculation was rising as to Freddie's medical condition.
We knew that Freddie was lost, and I had known it in my bones since 1983. When, at the nightclub called Heaven, in a room called the Star Bar, I said to Freddie, "Has your attitude and behavior changed in light of this new disease in America?" And he said, "Darling, my attitude is, fuck it. I'm doing everything with everybody." And I had that sinking feeling. There really is a sinking feeling. And I just thought, my friend is going to die.
Freddie's well-being continued to deteriorate. Yet, in a remarkable show of defiance, he continued to record with his bandmates. And in May 1989, the spectacular results arrived.
I want it all. I want it all. I want it all. And I want it now.
I Want It All does sound like a very defiant but optimistic piece of music. And I suppose it was produced at a time when Freddie Mercury was ill and unable to perform anymore. And yet the song has a tremendous resonance. Some people find it almost distasteful in a way, actually, kind of rather bombastic post-Margaret Thatcher era.
I want it all, and I want it now. That was the spirit of the 80s in many ways. And you can easily see Queen as a part of that spirit of the 80s. Self-indulgence and wealth. And if I want something, I'll have it now, I'll do it now. All of that, you know. I guess that was the impression. Very, very strong hook line, which makes it work as a track.
When they did I Want It All from The Miracle at the end of the 1980s, that was almost a return to the 70s. It was a great, epic, huge Queen anthem. It was hard rock, it was pomp rock, it was everything you wanted from one of those great Queen moments which invested the 70s. I want it all and I want it now.
Following in the footsteps of I Want It All came Queen's 13th studio album. Despite Mercury's illness, The Miracle was an undeniably confident new collection of songs.
They certainly weren't going to make an album of techno or acid house, it was, and so they were almost in that position, which I think a lot of groups get into, where they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. Because, you know, if they'd kept making Queen 2, everyone would have just said, well, you keep making this record. So they did make different records, and everyone said, well, why aren't you making a great Queen record? So I think with The Miracle, some of the stuff on there was going right back to Queen 2 and Sheer Heart Attack and things like that. And I think people just thought, oh, why are you doing that? But hey, you know, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
As with A Kind of Magic, The Miracle contained a title track which was also released as a single, this time in November 1989.
Every drop of rain that falls in Sahara Desert says it all, it's a miracle. All God's creations, great and small, the Golden Gate and the Taj Mahal, that's a miracle.
The Miracle itself has a kind of Beatles feel to it. When I listen to it now, it reminds me a bit of Iron Walrus. You know, it's that kind of John Lennon kind of surreal flavour to it. So maybe there's a little bit of a Beatles influence there.
The Miracle is a track, the title track is one that sounds good, but then again it's so mawkish and sententious. They actually sing the one thing that we're waiting for, peace on earth, an end to war. There it is, sat there, 100% serious. No One Vision fried chicken about it. He's forgotten his irony, and he's just singing it.
The one thing we're all waiting for is peace on earth, an end to war. It's a miracle we need, the miracle.
I think it's interesting to compare that with Was It All Worth It? Where again we're all thinking, oh, clearly this is Fred knowing he's in trouble, knowing he's got AIDS, knowing quite seriously he might die anytime soon. The very last line, he's saying, he suddenly says, oh yes, it was all worth it, after all, sort of thing. But because of the way he delivers it, he brings out the triteness and looks at it. And so it stops being silly, and his irony, quite properly, I think, brings out a certain heroism in that song, where he's facing his fate, whatever it may be.
Yes, it was a worthwhile experience.
Still one of those albums I think Queen fans will look back at and go, still one of the finest moments in their career, and yet we didn't know at the time the severity of the man's illness. So, you know, when you take that into account, I think it will be, you know, regarded as one of their best, you know, triumph almost against adversity.
If The Miracle had been Queen's show of defiance, time was fast approaching the band's final hour. And in 1991, the album Innuendo hit the shelves. The title track was unveiled a month before and proved to be an instant #1 hit single.
desert has said.
Innuendo was such a mammoth epic, 6.5 minutes, kind of dramatic opus, magnum opus, and very powerful piece. It's almost been overlooked in some respects, maybe because it came towards the end of Queen's career in the early 90s.
I think when Innuendo came out, there was this huge Queen have made Bohemian Rhapsody again. I mean, I think that lasted about 3 days, but there was that sort of feeling that you know, here is a huge number. There's a lot of things going on to it, and obviously then, you know, people were aware, or Freddie was certainly aware of what was happening.
Innuendo as a piece of music itself, the song, was very progressive. It was Queen deciding, as it were, well, this is it. There's so much we'd love to do, so much we'd like to explore.
Not the same elements, it's no way a copy, but it is them using the skills that they showed on Bohemian Rhapsody to structure a great long track whilst building in an enormous amount of elements, you know, bits of flamenco and chorale and hard rock and God knows what there, you know, some familiar elements and some that aren't. The Spanish element being an unusual one there.
You can't be anything you want to be. Just turn yourself into anything you think that you could ever be. Be free with your tempo. Be free. Be free. Surrender your ego. Be free. Be free.
It works because they're such great musicians. And I think it works partly because although there was an investment of forethought, there's also a certain spontaneity, which is on the album as well. There's a humour about the album. And I think Innuendo as an album worked because it is very diverse. It represented Queen through the ages in a funny way.
Innuendo is a heartening final achievement because you get the sense of forward motion again. We're not just doing the same thing. Now, ironically and terribly, the reason you have the sense of forward motion artistically is because Freddie is ill and is confronting it in breathtakingly autobiographical style.
This autobiographical style was particularly evident on Innuendo's standout moments, one of which was the operatic strains of The Show Must Go On.
Show must go on. The show must go on. Yeah. Inside my heart is breaking. My makeup may be flaking, but my smile still.
The Show Must Go On, people take as Freddie maybe saying to the rest of the band, you know what, I'm not going to be around for long, but I hope you're just not going to give up and give in. But I actually feel it was perhaps more to the fans, basically saying, well, I won't be around for very much longer, but I don't want you to forget me. I don't want you to forget this band, because the show must go on, and we are the show. So I think it was Freddie talking to the fans in a way of basically, don't forget what we have achieved as a band. Don't forget what you supported us for so long about. And please carry on waving the flag for Queen and for Freddie Mercury, because without you doing it, the show won't go on, and the show must go on.
I wonder whether it was an agreement between the four of them at the time that, okay, whatever happens, you know, Queen will go on.
Whatever happens, I leave it all to chance. Another heartache, another failed romance. On and on. Does anybody know?
As the other members have said, an inspirational piece, because to do the videos, Freddie, who was in a terribly weakened and emaciated state, would put on these bursts of energy. And everyone thought, where did he get the strength? Well, he gets the strength from the work he loves. And Freddie was devoted to that work he loves.
It's a little melodrama all of its own to me, like a show song or something. It's big, but big in a melodramatic way. And I just don't feel it I don't feel it as autobiographical. It's like Essence of Fred, but not autobiographical. It's him rising above that and doing a real show business song to me.
If The Show Must Go On was a song of bombastic strength, another memorable moment from Innuendo takes on a wholly different, more reflective attitude. The emotional ballad, These Are the Days of Our Lives.
the old days, long ago. When we were kids, when we were young, things seemed so perfect, you know. The days were endless, we were crazy, we were young. The sun was always shining, we just lived for fun. Sometimes it seems like lately, I just don't know.
These are the days of our lives is a song that makes you struggle sometimes to get through it, because it is Freddie Mercury in a way looking back and saying, this is it. In a way, it's basically enjoy the moment, because you never know what the next minute's going to bring. And it was a look back at what was a fantastic career.
In that sense, it's another very poignant kind of performance, and seems to reflect maybe his thoughts about life in general. And despite all the rewards, all the fun, all the hedonistic kind of joys of being a rock star, there's always this kind of feeling of a vacuum, or maybe a loss of direction, a loss of sense of purpose. So I think that's expressed in this particular song.
How can you listen to that record and not put everything in context and see it as how it was meant? And in a way, you know, it was fantastic that he was able, and the band were able to make the sort of Last Will and Testament together.
Those were the days of our lives. The bad things in life were so few. Those days are all gone now, but one thing is true. When I look and I find I still love you, you can't turn back the clock.
It's a wonderful encapsulation of a career. It's his autobiography, in a way. I've had a great time. I wouldn't change anything. I don't regret anything, because these are the days of our lives. This is where we are. This is who we are. And aren't we so lucky?
The beautiful sentiments of living each day and being grateful for the people whom you have loved.
It's very pretty, these are the days of our lives. It's very pretty. And he's going to die. Isn't that strange? It's very pretty, and he's going to die. Strange, intangible. I can't quite get to grips with it. It's a good track, for sure.
Queen had achieved something remarkable. Even with their lead singer gravely ill, they had managed to produce perhaps the most complex and satisfying album of their career.
It really is an extraordinary package of work. And I was sure that the public didn't really appreciate the achievement of that album when it was released.
I think when you listen to the album in its entirety, it's not a concept album as such, but it does almost sort of come to a conclusion. And you know, it is almost like a full stop.
I still love you. I still love you.
Freddie Mercury passed away in November 1991, leaving behind his legacy as perhaps the greatest popular entertainer of all time. This was not, however, the end for Queen. The inclusion of Bohemian Rhapsody in the movie Wayne's World meant that the band enjoyed something of a resurgence in America. Renewed interest continued to grow throughout the early 90s, and in 1995, Queen released Made in Heaven, a collection of previously unreleased material from their time with Freddie.
In this world of cool deception, just your smile can smooth my ride. These troubled days.
We're living in an interesting era where people are reviving and resurrecting tapes from vaults. They're reviving and resurrecting artists. You've got Elvis Presley appearing on stage with his 1950s band. You've got Frank Sinatra playing the Palladium based on modern technology. How long will it be before Freddie Mercury appears on stage with Queen? I will predict it's going to happen because of technology and the way you can take images and so forth. Queen will probably at some point do a show with Freddie Mercury. It's a bit ghoulish, to be honest. And my problem with Made in Heaven, it is very ghoulish.
Freddie was a bit of a workaholic, and to get it back at the illness, you know, he really sort of plowed himself into his work and would spend, you know, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours sometimes in the studio.
Freddie is fading. There's no question about it. It's amazing they got some good stuff out of it. And I didn't mind the posthumous releases because they were still good enough to be released.
This could be heaven for everyone.
It's Queen finishing an album without quite knowing what a quarter of the band would have liked to do. And yes, they recorded a load of stuff before Freddie Mercury died, possibly with the idea that maybe at some later date they could be revisited, the tapes could be revisited, and it's their prerogative to do it.
This could be heaven for everyone. This could be heaven, could be heaven.
I do think that it was very useful for the Queen fans to have the posthumous hits. It's easy to be cynical when you have your own comfortable, insulated life and you look at fans who are emotionally involved with their heroes and sneer and say, oh, that's pretty pathetic, really. Don't you have a life? But in fact, when you are emotionally involved, it matters so much that you are able to participate in a full grieving process. And part of that was getting involved with the last recordings.
You've got the instrumentation of Queen with Freddie, so, you know, on paper, it should work. In reality, it's not bad.
Despite the mixed reception, the album was an immediate #1 hit. It was clear that dedicated Queen fans saw it for what it was. A fitting epitaph to a unique and epic musical force.
I tell you what strikes me about the album, which is remarkable about it, is the unnamed track 13 instrumental. That seems like Freddie's special memorial. It's probably significant that there are no lyrics to it. It's as if they had to shut up verbally. They clam up, and it's like a meditation. And I don't meditate, that's not my scene. It works. Something about that has a intensity and seriousness which they don't make in their songs. So I think that that's a forgotten, quite significant piece of Queen music.
As time went on, there would prove to be further incarnations of Queen. A recent tour saw Brian May and Roger Taylor employing the vocal talents of Paul Rodgers.
I want to break free. I want to break free. I want to break free from your lies. You're so satisfied. I don't need you.
While this was regarded as a triumph, another recent Queen project has received a good amount of critical backlash. A musical collaboration with Ben Elton entitled We Will Rock You.
I went to see We Will Rock You, and I left at the interval, walking down Tottenham Court Road going, heinous, heinous! I couldn't stand it.
Find any journalist that likes it and I'll give you £20, English money, and everything.
You just can't keep those songs hidden away. You just can't keep them on an album, a dusty album that you listen to from time to time, because that's what Queen were like in 1986 or 1980 or whenever. So the music is still alive and well, and it just goes to prove that actually after a band has written and recorded and performed a song, that it's almost out of their control, it's out of their hands, and you know, the public determine the life and the longevity of an album and the music after it's been released.
However many new incarnations of Queen may arise, one thing remains clear: that the astonishing legacy of the original four-piece will keep them at the forefront of popular culture for many more years to come.
Having been critically ignored during the 1970s, they have become more and more appreciated with the passage of time because the quality of what they did has become more and more apparent.
Man, what an actor, what a performer, what a player, you know. What a singer too, but really what a presence on stage.
They stood head and shoulders above everything, and people are in awe to this day of what they achieved and what they did. Rightly so. One of the greatest bands we will ever be privileged to witness.